My name is Karen, and I am 67 years old. It's strange to think of myself as elderly. I don't feel it, not in the way people imagine when they think of an old woman, frail, hunched, and slow. I still have my hair, though it's turning gray, and I still move about the house with relative ease, though my joints sometimes creak when I bend too low. But something in me has changed, something I can't name. Maybe it's the feeling of becoming irrelevant, of living in the background, or maybe it's the loneliness that settles like dust in the corners of rooms. I was married once to Robert. We built this house together, each brick placed with care, every room filled with the promise of a life well lived. Robert was a good man, though he had his flaws, as we all do. He worked hard, came home tired, and loved me in his way. He wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. After he died, 2 years ago now, I didn't know how to keep going. We had no children for the longest time, but then, unexpectedly, David came along. David was our miracle, and for a time I thought he would be everything we'd wanted. I wasn't ready to let him go to school, and then he grew into an adult. Too quickly, I thought. He married Claire, a lovely woman, though I can't say we've ever been especially close. I didn't know her well when they first married, but I tried. I made her welcome in my home. But as life often goes, you grow older and start to see things for what they really are. Sometimes people stay distant not because of any fault, but because of an unspoken understanding, a quiet realization that they simply don't need each other in the way they once did. When Robert passed, I was left to manage this house alone. There were the usual difficulties: paperwork, taxes, bills, but more than that, there was the ache of waking up to an empty bed. I kept myself busy, filled the quiet with daily routines, cooking, cleaning, and keeping up with everything Robert had left behind. But the walls seemed to get taller, the spaces larger, and then the stroke came. It was mild at first, nothing too serious, but enough to make things difficult. I lost feeling in my right side, had trouble remembering things, and I couldn't drive anymore. That's when David offered to take me in. He said he and Claire could help, that it would be good for me to be around my grandkids. At first, I was hesitant. I had my pride after all. I had always managed on my own, and now, suddenly, I was supposed to lean on them? But I didn't want to be a burden, so I agreed. Moving in with them meant giving up my space, my independence, and the house I had shared with Robert for so many years. But it was only temporary, I told myself, just until I could get back on my feet. 4 years later, I'm still here. It's not that David and Claire are unkind. They aren't. But over time, it's become clear to me that they see me as, well, as something in the background, something that's always there, like the wallpaper or the furniture, but never the focus of attention. I help out with what I can. I cook when Claire doesn't feel like it, I drive the kids to school, and I keep the house running. They thank me, of course, but it's a distant kind of gratitude, the sort you give someone who does their job well, but without any real affection. It's as if my presence is expected, a given. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever felt overlooked, you'll understand the sensation. And then there's Christmas. Christmas used to be a time for family, a time when we gathered together, the house filled with laughter and warmth. Robert and I would sit by the tree, exchanging small but meaningful gifts, the fire crackling in the background. But now, with David and Claire, it's different. The house isn't quite the same, and neither am I. This year, I did everything I could to make it feel like the holidays again. I decorated the tree, carefully hanging the ornaments that had been passed down through the years, each one holding a small piece of memory. I baked cookies, the smell of cinnamon filling the kitchen, hoping the scent would bring some cheer. I placed candles on the mantel, their soft glow reflecting in the windows as snowflakes fell outside. Claire had asked me not to buy any gifts this year. "Don't spend any money, Mom," she said with a smile. "We've already got everything we need." I nodded, though inside I felt a pang. I knew they didn't expect anything from me. I wasn't even sure if they would buy anything for me. Still, I thought perhaps this year they would notice me. Maybe they would see all the effort I put into making things feel normal, into making the house feel warm. Maybe they would remember me, just a little. On Christmas Eve, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat by the tree. The lights twinkled in the darkened room, and for a moment I allowed myself to pretend that it was still like it used to be, when Robert and I would sit together, exchanging stories and laughter. But this year, it was just me, alone, sitting in the silence. The house felt cold, despite the fire. I don't know why I thought things would change. They never did. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and I would once again play my part, quietly, unobtrusively, in the background. The next morning, Christmas Day arrived in the usual way. No fanfare, no great celebration. It started just like every other day. The same kitchen noises, the same routine. I woke up early, as I always did, before the sun had fully risen. It was still dark outside, the world covered in a quiet blanket of snow. I shuffled to the kitchen, the old wooden floors creaking beneath my slippers. The house felt empty despite the bustle of the day to come. I brewed coffee, poured myself a cup, and sat at the table, staring out of the window as I tried to gather the strength to face the day. It was going to be a good day, I told myself. Christmas should be a time of joy, of family, of memories. I could still make it a good day. I was determined to. Claire came down first, her footsteps light on the stairs. She looked exhausted. Maybe it was just the weight of the season. After all, she was managing both the kids and her job, along with all the holiday preparations. She smiled at me, a tired but polite smile. "Morning, Mom. I'm sorry, I know I haven't had a chance to help with breakfast. Kids are already awake and buzzing around." She paused, glancing at the table. "You okay?" I smiled back, nodding. "I'm fine, just having my coffee." The kids, Olivia and Ben, came bounding down the stairs next, their excited chatter filling the air as they rushed into the living room. Their little hands pulled at the presents under the tree, their voices rising in delight as they started tearing through wrapping paper, faces lighting up with each new toy. I watched them for a moment, then quietly stood up to start preparing breakfast. I could hear David coming down the stairs, followed by Claire, who joined me in the kitchen. "Everything ready?" he asked, his voice warm but distracted, as if his mind was already somewhere else. Maybe it was the work he had to do, or maybe it was just the way things had always been. Me, the background character, helping with the things that needed doing. It didn't matter. I was used to it. I nodded as I cracked eggs into a bowl. "It's almost done." They sat down at the table, and we ate breakfast together. I watched as they chatted about plans for the day. They didn't ask me what I was doing or if I had any plans. They just assumed I would be there, quiet, helpful, and unobtrusive, just like always. I wasn't angry, just resigned. It was how things had become, and I had learned to accept it. After breakfast, we all gathered around the tree. The kids were already jumping up and down, urging everyone to open their gifts. There was no question about whether or not I would be included. Of course, I would sit and watch. That was my role now, observing, but never really part of the moment. David started handing out gifts. The kids' excitement was contagious, their giggles filling the air as they opened one present after another. The room buzzed with the sound of wrapping paper being torn apart, and for a moment I allowed myself to enjoy the chaos, the happy voices, the laughter. It was what I had always hoped for when I envisioned the holidays with my family. But then I noticed something. 11 gifts were stacked neatly on the floor. 11. I looked around at the faces of my family as they opened their presents, one after another. The kids were thrilled, David was smiling, Claire was beaming. But not once did anyone look at me. Not once did anyone hand me a gift. Not even a token of appreciation for the things I had done. There was nothing for me under the tree. I sat there, frozen for a moment. The silence in my chest grew louder, drowning out the laughter and the excitement around me. It wasn't anger I felt, not exactly. It was more like an old, familiar ache. The same ache that had been growing inside me for the last few years. The one that reminded me that I was no longer central to their lives. When the gift giving was over, I quietly slipped away. I could feel their eyes on me, but I didn't dare look up. I didn't need to. I knew they were only concerned with themselves, with their own excitement. I had no place in this moment. I went into the kitchen, quietly putting things away. I cleaned up the crumbs from breakfast, wiped down the counters, and washed the dishes. I didn't make a sound. The silence felt so heavy, like I was invisible. I could hear the kids laughing in the other room, but their voices seemed muffled, distant, as though I were standing on the edge of their world, unable to cross over. David and Claire were sitting in the living room, discussing plans for the rest of the day. I heard David mention something about visiting friends, and Claire nodded. The kids were already playing with their new toys, their voices filled with joy. But no one called out to me. No one asked me what I was doing, if I wanted to join them. I wasn't even on the periphery of their plans. It was as if I were already gone, as if I had already faded into the background. And that's when I made a decision. The evening arrived too quickly, as if time itself had grown impatient. Christmas dinner, once a grand occasion filled with laughter and conversation, felt like just another meal. I sat at the table with them, this time in a less prominent spot, my chair tucked at the edge, unnoticed unless someone accidentally bumped into it. The warmth of the house, once comforting, now felt suffocating in a different way. I kept my hands folded in my lap as they ate, occasionally offering a quiet comment or responding to a question, but more often than not, I stayed silent, letting the noise of their voices wash over me. David sat across from me, a slight frown between his brows. Claire, sitting next to him, laughed and chatted with the kids, her attention almost entirely on them. It was almost as if they were in their own little bubble, separated from me by an invisible wall. I didn't mind. I'd grown used to it, to being nothing more than a shadow in their lives. We ate our meal: turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and the various trimmings that always felt too much for too little. The conversation drifted in and out of my focus. At one point, I found myself staring at the steam rising from my plate, trying to remember the last time I had felt truly involved in one of these moments. "Dad," Claire said, her voice breaking through my thoughts, "maybe we should make a toast to family." David looked at her, smiling, but it was more of a polite gesture than a real connection. "Yeah, good idea," he said. "To family, to comfort." They clinked their glasses together, and the sound echoed in my mind. My glass remained untouched. I had nothing to say, nothing to offer, and that was fine. I wasn't upset, not exactly. I had long learned to expect nothing from them. After dinner, the kids dashed back to their toys, while Claire and David retreated to the living room, where they started watching something on TV. Their voices, light and carefree, seemed to form an impenetrable barrier between us. I could feel the weight of their disinterest, like a curtain falling between us, and I sat there, still and quiet. I cleared the table slowly. I moved methodically, stacking plates and utensils, doing everything without a word, without asking for help. They didn't offer, and I didn't expect them to. I had become nothing more than a housekeeper in their eyes. I didn't mind. It was easier that way. When I finished, I wiped down the table and the counters. The sound of the dishcloth rubbing against the wood was the only sound in the room. Then, without a word, I stood up and walked toward the stairs. I passed by the basement door, and for a brief moment, something inside me stirred. It was the quiet whisper of something old and forgotten, a memory of my husband, perhaps, or maybe just of myself before all this. I didn't know anymore, but I didn't stop. I descended into the basement, the air colder as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The dim light flickered overhead as I moved to the back corner where the old filing cabinet stood. I hadn't opened it in months, but today it seemed necessary. Today I was going to act. I took the key from my pocket and unlocked the drawer, pulling out the folder that contained the paperwork for the house, mortgage papers, bills, receipts, everything, and as I flipped through the documents, a plan began to form in my mind. It wasn't a loud, dramatic plan. It wasn't one that screamed for attention. It was subtle, silent, a plan to remind them of something they'd long since forgotten, the things I had done for them, the sacrifices I had made. It was time to make them notice me. It was time to show them that I wasn't just the invisible woman who had faded into the background. I spent the next few hours in the basement, pulling out old receipts, updating the paperwork, making sure everything was in order. I had already decided there was no going back now. The world I had built, the one where I played my part quietly and without complaint, was over. I was going to make sure they knew I was still here. When I finished, I stood up and walked back upstairs. The house was silent, still filled with the muffled sounds of their holiday cheer, their lives moving on without me. But I wasn't going to let that continue. Not anymore. The morning after Christmas came, and with it, the weight of what I had done the night before. I woke up before anyone else, as usual. The house was cold. A sharp, quiet chill had settled into every corner. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the air, and as I sat there in the kitchen, sipping my coffee, I could hear the silence wrap around me, heavy and thick. I didn't mind it. It was the silence I had been waiting for, the silence that came before everything changed. I sat in my usual seat, staring at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick away. It was early, and I knew no one would be up for another hour or so. I didn't need anyone to notice me right now. I was alone, with nothing but the weight of my plan on my shoulders. I reached for my phone. The utility company had always made it easy for me to handle everything online, including the automatic payment for the gas bill. The same system that had kept the house warm, kept everything running smoothly, had also kept me in the background. It was all automated, all seamless, and none of them ever noticed how much I contributed, how much I had done. But today, I was going to make them notice. I opened the app, logged in, and navigated to the payment settings. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. This would change everything. It was a small act, a quiet one, but it was deliberate. I tapped the button, canceling the automatic payment for the gas bill. It was done. No turning back. Next, I grabbed my phone again and pulled up the supermarket's account. Claire had always insisted that we keep things simple, that I shouldn't bother with the shopping lists or the coupons, that she could handle it. So, I had let her. I had handed over control, quietly, without a second thought. But today, I was taking control back, even if it meant just a little rebellion. I deleted the credit card from the supermarket profile, the one I had linked to the account so many months ago, the one that had always been used to pay for their groceries, to buy the things they needed. I wasn't going to buy any more of their food, not without being seen, not without being noticed. Finally, I withdrew all the funds from the bank account they had access to, the one linked to everything, the utilities, the groceries, the automatic payments. I wasn't doing this out of spite. It was just a reminder that I was here, that I had been here all along, quietly holding everything together. It was time to make them feel the weight of it. As the transactions processed, I stood up, gathering the paperwork I had left in the basement. The folder was now complete, updated with everything I needed. I made sure to write down the contact number for the heating company, the one that would be calling to schedule the shutdown. I didn't want them to panic, not yet. I just wanted them to feel the change, to feel the cold, the absence of the comfort I had always provided. When I finished, I took a deep breath and stood in the center of the kitchen, the house still eerily quiet around me. It was done. I put on my coat and scarf. I needed to get out of the house, away from their warmth, away from the noise. I needed space. I walked out the door without a word, not even a glance back. I didn't want to hear their confusion, their attempts to explain it away. I needed to breathe. I went to the little cafe down the street. It was small but warm, filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and pastries. The quiet hum of conversation was a relief. I could sit there for hours, with no one asking anything of me, no one expecting anything. I ordered my tea and a croissant, settling into a corner booth by the window. The warmth of the cafe filled me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The following evening, the house was colder than it had ever been. I could hear the muffled sound of footsteps above me, the occasional murmur of conversation, but it wasn't the same. The warmth that had once enveloped the place was gone. The furnace had shut off, and the air was sharp with the bite of winter. It wasn't a brutal cold, but a steady, insistent chill that seemed to seep into everything, the walls, the furniture, the very air we breathed. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the clock tick away slowly, waiting. I knew they would notice soon enough. They always did, eventually. The cold had a way of making people pay attention. It was around dinner time when I heard the first voice raised in irritation. David's. "What's going on with the heating?" he called out from the living room, his voice cutting through the stillness. I didn't answer immediately, letting the silence linger. The cold was spreading inch by inch through the rooms. I could hear the faint shuffle of his feet as he moved through the house. Then came Claire's voice, a softer tone, but laced with concern. "Did you check the thermostat?" she asked, her voice barely rising above the sound of the creaking floorboards. I imagined her standing by the device, pressing the buttons in a futile attempt to make it work. I didn't respond at first, letting them come to the realization I didn't need to say anything. They had been so wrapped up in their own world, so sure that everything would continue running smoothly without effort, that the sudden absence of comfort, of the heat they'd always taken for granted, was like a slap in the face. Finally, David came into the kitchen, his face flushed from the cold. He looked around, confused, his brows furrowed. "Karen," he said, his voice a little sharper than usual. "What's going on with the heat? It's freezing in here." I looked up slowly, my gaze meeting his, but I didn't speak immediately. I let the question hang in the air for a moment, savoring the discomfort that had finally settled between us. "Perhaps," I said quietly, my voice even, almost cold. "The one who creates comfort should be on the list, or in the payment form." There was a long pause, a beat of silence where I could see the gears turning in his mind. Slowly, the realization began to dawn. The silence between us deepened, and I could feel it, the weight of everything I had done, of everything I had been silently carrying for so many years. "Karen, don't start," Claire said from the doorway, her voice tinged with irritation. "You're dramatizing. It's just a problem with the furnace. We'll call someone. There's no need for—" But I wasn't listening. I stood up, gathered my coat, and without another word, walked out of the room. "I'm going out," I called back, but no one answered. I didn't wait for them to say anything. The words were already too late. The cold followed me out the door, and I stepped into the night. I needed air. I needed distance. I walked to the cafe, the one down the street that had always been my refuge. The warmth inside wrapped around me like a familiar embrace, and I took a deep breath, letting it all go for just a moment. I ordered a simple cup of tea and sat at a corner table by the window, watching the world pass by. The sound of the street outside seemed far away, muffled by the thick glass. It was quieter here, softer. There was something peaceful about the separation, the distance between me and the house. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel the weight of the actions I had taken. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm, a sense of freedom. The next few days passed in a slow, almost dreamlike haze. I could feel the house growing colder with each passing hour. Each morning, I woke up early, as usual, but I didn't go straight to the kitchen like I always did. Instead, I sat in the living room, watching the frost form on the windows. The cold had crept into every room, but it was in the living room that it felt most profound. That room had always been the heart of the house, where we gathered as a family. But now it felt like a distant memory, the warmth of togetherness replaced by a biting emptiness. I could hear the muffled sounds of my son's footsteps as he moved through the house, the creak of the floorboards echoing down the hallway. He was moving more quickly now, agitated. I didn't mind. In the evenings, I would sit in the quiet of the basement, flipping through old photo albums or reading books, giving them the space to feel the discomfort of my absence. I could hear them argue sometimes, their voices rising in frustration, but I never made a move to intervene. I wasn't part of their equation anymore. I had made sure of that. It wasn't until the third day, when the temperature in the house dropped to an unbearable low, that they finally began to feel the weight of it. I knew they would notice when they woke up in the morning and found the heaters off again, the air sharp and unforgiving. David had always been the one to complain about the cold the most. He had never liked it when the temperature dropped below a certain point, and now his usual comfort was gone. Claire would have been in denial, trying to make excuses, but the cold wouldn't be ignored. I was sitting in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea, when I heard David's voice again. This time, it was louder, more urgent. "Karen," he shouted, his voice thick with frustration. "What the hell is going on? The house is freezing. Why isn't the heat working?" I didn't answer right away. I took my time, letting him stew in his own confusion. When I finally stood up and walked into the living room, they were both there. David standing by the thermostat, his face flushed with anger, and Claire, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. I didn't say anything immediately. I just stood there, letting them look at me, letting the silence build. The cold seemed to stretch between us, like a palpable force, thick and heavy. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm, controlled. Maybe the one who creates comfort should be on the list, or in the payment form. There was a long silence after that. David looked at me, his face slowly changing from anger to confusion, then to something else, something deeper. I could see it in his eyes. The truth was starting to settle in. You, you canceled the payment? He asked, his voice quiet now, almost disbelieving. I didn't answer, just gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Claire stepped forward, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "You're being dramatic," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "It's just a furnace issue. We'll call someone. It's no big deal." But I wasn't interested in excuses. I wasn't interested in explanations. I had done what I needed to do. "I'm going out," I said, and without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door, leaving them to deal with the cold. The days that followed were a blur. I spent my time at the cafe, watching the world move around me. I didn't go back to the house. The silence there was enough. The house had stopped being a home for me a long time ago. Now, it was just a building, empty and cold, like my relationships with them. I heard from the neighbors that David and Claire had started borrowing heaters from everyone they knew. It wasn't a surprise. They always had someone to rely on. But it wasn't the same. The discomfort was there, subtle at first, but it was building. It was like the cold was seeping into everything, into their conversations, into the way they looked at each other. The warmth they had taken for granted was gone, and now they had to reckon with it. 3 days later, I was sitting in the cafe when I saw Claire's car drive by, slowing down as it passed. I didn't wave, didn't even look up. I could see the frustration on her face through the window, the way her jaw was set tight. She wasn't used to this. They weren't used to being made to feel the consequences of their actions. A week passed, and by then, I knew what was happening. They were starting to crack. They applied for a rental apartment, looking for somewhere warm to live. It wasn't even the first time they'd talked about leaving, but this time it was different. They were serious. I didn't feel anything. Not relief, not guilt, nothing. They didn't talk to me. They didn't ask if I needed anything. They didn't try to fix things. They just left. A month later, the house was empty. They were gone. The house was still cold, but it no longer mattered. The silence had settled in, and for the first time in years, it was a silence that belonged to me. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of the floorboards as they settled, but other than that, the house had become a hollow shell of what it once was. There were no arguments, no complaints, no laughter from my grandchildren echoing down the hall. The house was just a building now, empty except for the memories I chose to hold on to. I spent the first few days cleaning, tidying up the remnants of their departure. I took my time, methodically putting things away, wiping down countertops. Their things were still scattered around. My daughter-in-law's perfume lingering on the bathroom sink, a sweater David had left draped over the couch. But it all felt irrelevant now. Everything had become nothing more than objects, reminders of a time that had passed, of a family that had walked away without a word. Christmas came again, just a year later. The house, though still cold, was no longer filled with the empty, uncomfortable tension that had lingered the previous year. I had learned to live with the quiet, to embrace it even. It was different this time, more like an old friend that had come to stay. I had no expectations, no hopes for anything to change. I had already made peace with what had happened. I took my time decorating the tree, as I always had. I put the same ornaments on it, the ones my husband and I had bought together all those years ago. There was something oddly comforting about the familiarity of it all. The same twinkling lights, the same red ribbons, the same fragile glass balls. I thought about the times when we had decorated it together, when the house had been full of warmth and life. This time, there was no pressure. No one was coming to gather around the tree. No one was there to open gifts or watch the children race down the stairs to see what Santa had left. There would be no laughter, no chaos, no one to complain about the gifts they didn't like or the food they didn't want to eat. It was just me. When the evening came, I sat alone in the living room, looking at the tree. The house was still, but I could feel the presence of the past in the air. I reached down beside the tree and retrieved one small, neatly wrapped box. It was the only gift this year, and it was for me. Inside the box were three simple things: a pair of woolen socks, a book, and a small hand mirror. The mirror was old, tarnished, the edges slightly chipped from years of use. It was the one my husband had given me when we first moved into the house. It hadn't been the most romantic gift, but it had meant something. To me, it had always been a symbol of my life with him, with them. I held the items in my hands, feeling the weight of them, and then I looked at the reflection in the mirror. For the first time in a long while, I saw myself clearly, no longer just the background, no longer just part of the scenery. I saw a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had given everything she had to the people she thought would care for her in return. And yet, they had left. I smiled softly, though it was a sad smile. "Thank you," I whispered aloud, speaking not to anyone but to the house, to the air, to the silence. "Thank you for the house, for the silence, and for not being a gift. I'm a human being." I paused for a moment, letting the words sink in, and then, without another thought, I stood up, walked over to the thermostat, and turned on the heat, just for myself. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to wait for them to return. I had learned that sometimes the greatest form of revenge wasn't anger or confrontation. Sometimes it was simply walking away, taking back what was rightfully mine, claiming the silence, the solitude, and the warmth as my own. As the heat slowly began to hum in the background, I leaned back into the chair, the flickering light from the Christmas tree casting shadows on the walls. It was just me, and I was at peace. This was how it was meant to be. This was how it had always been meant to be. And the silence spoke volumes. The house was still, as it had been since they left. But now there was something different. The air felt less oppressive, the silence less suffocating. I had spent so many years catering to others, bending my life to their needs, that I had forgotten what it felt like to live solely for myself. But now, in this emptiness, I was beginning to reclaim what I had lost. I woke early, as I always had, but this time there was no rush, no breakfast to prepare for anyone, no chores to finish before the kids woke up, no demands from my daughter-in-law. I could do whatever I wanted, at my own pace. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts clearly. I started by organizing the basement. It had become a catch-all for everything over the years, but now it felt like a fresh canvas. I pulled out old boxes, sorted through the dust-covered papers, and began to sift through the remnants of a life that was now gone. There were old photos, dusty letters from long-forgotten friends, and wedding gifts that had never been opened. Some things I threw away, others I kept. But it was the act of sorting through the past that gave me clarity. I found an envelope buried deep in a box. It was old, faded, almost crumbling, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from my husband, written to me many years ago, before his death. I opened it carefully, feeling my heart catch in my throat. The letter was simple. It spoke of love, of gratitude, and of his hopes for our future. But there was one line that stuck with me, a line I hadn't remembered reading before. "In times of hardship, remember to always choose yourself first. You cannot pour from an empty cup." I stared at those words for a long time. How many years had I spent pouring myself out for others? How many times had I put my own needs aside for the sake of my family? I had sacrificed so much only to be left behind when they no longer needed me. But I had never truly chosen myself, not until now. The following days were spent in quiet reflection. I walked through the garden, which had been neglected for years, but now seemed to beckon me. There was a wild beauty in the overgrown flowers and tangled vines, a reminder that things could still grow, even after being forgotten. One afternoon, while I was tending to the garden, I received a call. It was from my son, David. "Mom," he said, his voice tense, "we need to talk." I felt a pang in my chest. It had been a month since they left, and I hadn't heard from him. He hadn't even called on Christmas. Part of me didn't want to answer, didn't want to reopen the wound. But I did, because I knew this was part of the process, part of my journey. I braced myself, but when I heard his voice on the other end, I felt a strange calm wash over me. He started by apologizing. Though the words were clumsy, they were there. He spoke about regrets, about how they had taken me for granted. He admitted that they had been wrong, but the words felt hollow. He wanted to come over, to make things right. I paused, unsure of how to respond. I had no anger left to give. What had already happened. But I also realized that I didn't need him to fix it. I didn't need him to apologize. I had already done the hardest part. I had let go. David, I said softly, you don't need to come over. I've moved on. There was a long silence, and then he whispered, I'm sorry, Mom. I know, I replied, but I'm not sorry anymore. And with that, I hung up the phone. I spent the rest of the day alone in the house. I turned on the heat, made myself a warm cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching the snow fall. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. I knew there were still things I had to do, paperwork to settle, legalities to work through, but I no longer felt burdened by them. I had taken back my life. It was mine now, for the first time in decades. And as the evening came, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat at the table and wrote a letter to myself. It was a letter of gratitude, of acknowledgement. It was a promise that from now on, I would never forget the importance of choosing myself first. The warmth from the heating unit enveloped me, and I felt a peace I hadn't thought possible.